There we go.
Yeah, because we could.
Oh, let me do my hair.
Oh yeah, there you go. My hair's so long too, like I gotta get it trimmed.
Fix my curl.
That's okay though.
Yeah, because we could hang it up on the Agitare YouTube and like share it on LinkedIn if you want to share these methods more widely.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's definitely good feedback. Well, it's 8:01. I appreciate you all joining in. I really don't know a whole lot of you very well, so if you don't mind, let's do some intros. My name,
but you, yeah.
Stationed here at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. I've been here for like 7-8 months, not too long. I first got exposed to, because we all hear like the term culture, right? And it's used in a pretty abstract sense of like, hey, we gotta fix our culture. And like, cool, I don't know what that means. So I had a workshop that I went through back in 2020 where one of the facilitators did a really good job of breaking it down into tangible points. And he used processes taken from gamestorming.com, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with, right? So 2020 was my first exposure to that. That led to reading some books about design thinking and looking up some more facilitator processes, which got me into the design thinking realm. And then from there, we've been using the processes that we're going to be going through in here and just growing from it. So I'm a 1-in-1 by trade. I am in the 480th ISR wing, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Yeah, that's me.
Sweet. I'll say hi. I'm Daniel Holter. I was in Hawaii for about a year when we launched Agitare about coming up on 2 years ago. So I'm originally a Chinese linguist, but these days I work at Air Force CyberWorks as a facilitator, mainly as a facilitator and like a workshop designer, facilitating groups to navigate complexity and solve problems. So I've been through a lot of design thinking training, and these days I find myself in the educator role a lot. And that's it.
Hey, I'm Michael. I just follow Daniel wherever I can. So I try to learn as much as I can from Daniel and Austin. But I've been doing innovation stuff for 4 or 5 years now or so. I'm at AFPC currently in the innovation cell, trying to teach and educate folks on innovation and design thinking methods in order to shape culture, hopefully at AFPC, right? So very interested to see what you've got today.
I guess I'll introduce myself. I'm Austin Wiggins. I am a futurist and designer here at Air Force CyberWorks. I've been toying around with the term design futurists. Don't know how I feel about it yet, but I'll throw it out there and just test the waters how it sounds for me. I work at the cross section between future studies and design, and a lot of that includes a lot of facilitation, a lot of workshopping, which is why Daniel and I work together just about all the time at this point. I'm a Korean linguist originally. Spent a lot of time there at Fort Meade, and then spent some time in Korea also. Yeah, I just find myself doing a bunch of weird things these days with CyberWorks. It's just like, yeah, here's this weird project you want to do. I'm like, yeah, cool, sounds fine. John, I don't know if you, okay, never mind. You just came on. Wi-Fi super spotty, it looks like.
Go through the chat. Edwards.
Oh, nice. Project Mercury cohort 4.
Cool. Yeah, super cool. Alrighty. Well,
there we go. Sorry, guys. I'm online now.
I knew that name. Now I know the face.
Yeah, Yeah, so I meant to say 5, cohort 5, and I'm coaching cohort 6 right now for Project Mercury.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I recognize the face, didn't recognize the name at first.
Yeah.
But yeah, I
I
remember.
was in cohort 5, so I think we're in the same one. Yeah.
John was also at the Enlisted Education of the Future workshop.
It's cool. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I try to.
Right.
Yeah.
Super cool. All righty. Well, I really appreciate you all joining in. I'm definitely coming from a place of humility, right? I believe very strongly in the processes that I'm going to share with y'all, but we're definitely looking for where can we grow from here. So it's in part like, hey, definitely looking to spread the word. Like, here's some tools that have been really working out for us, and if there's any way that we can make it better, cool, let's do it too. So as we go along, please stop me as we go. This is definitely not a formal presentation. It's meant to, let's have a discussion as we go. Sound good? Cool. All right, I'm gonna share my screen. Alrighty. Can you all see my screen? All right. So the main quote, it's personally my favorite quote, and it kind of like drives this talking point. Well, the purpose behind all this, and that's culture beats strategy so much that culture is strategy. I'm sure you've all have worked for plenty of bosses in the past who have visions and they execute, and then along the way, you know, maybe things were a little bit bumpy because the human aspect wasn't aligned with what the goals were. A lot of times when we have discussions on culture, a lot of flight chiefs, flight commanders, senior enlisted leaders and commanders, they kind of look at culture as like a little fun like side excursion. Like, hey, if we got the time and we got the bandwidth and we can have a fun little offsite, a one little day, then we'll get after this culture thing. In my experience, that's usually, no, I mean, it doesn't work, right? If your people aren't aligned with where the unit is headed, then it's just not going to work. So that's kind of like where we're coming from with this. The goal is to be able to show like, hey, culture is so important. The way that folks interact with each other, the language that peer-to-peers use with each other, the language that the commander uses down the chain, the processes and the way we go about executing the mission, all of that matters, and all that needs to be aligned with whatever the unit wants to be about. A lot of times units will have like a bumper sticker that says, this is our mission, this is our vision, these are our values, but that's all it is a bumper sticker. So the goal of everything we're going to go through is to first diagnose what is the culture within your team or within your organization. Let's make that not some abstract word out there that has a fuzzy meaning. And then how do you take where you're at and then project out where you want to go and then navigate through there as a team. And the culture mapping process that we use is a repeatable, scalable framework that we have found to be more successful. What questions do you all have before we continue?
So I'm sort of curious, as you're, I mean, you might get to this because that's kind of a lead-in. I'm curious how you define culture because a lot of people go into it with probably a different sense of what culture means.
No, that's a great question. And the talking point of like everyone has their own definition, 100%. Like common definitions are super important, just to set a foundation, right? So this is the definition that resonates with me the most. And there's so many definitions out there, right? But a shared set of values, attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterize an institution or organization. That one resonates with me the most. And there's another term that I think is super important to define, if I can find that slide. here it is, organizational design, which I'm sure this one resonates with y'all with your heavy backgrounds in design thinking and processes, human-centered processes. Organizational design is not treated the same way as it should. A lot of times when we build processes within units, it's all about what is my mission, what is my input, and what is my output from a purely mission, like machine perspective, as opposed to if I structure one flight this way with these business rules, how are the human interactions going to be shaped with another team, right? So part of this, and this workshop that I sent out ahead of time, it's on here. You can download it, do whatever you want with it. But its main goal is to say like, hey, there are a lot of academics out there on how we can be smarter about how we build units essentially, or shape how units interact, and setting that definition of organizational design and unit culture, or I'm sorry, culture is super important. Definitely a good question.
I assume that you're going to get to this later because you mentioned the data analytics part.
Yeah.
But going from your definition of culture to the data analytics part, I am interested to see how that's carried out, because I can see how trying to quantize what you have just defined being a potential problem.
Yeah, it's tough. What we tried to align it in a way that would resonate with officers. My screen's still being shared, so we'll just jump to that super quick. We'll come back to it. The synopsis is that we want to align whatever data that we provide in a format that resonates with our officer counterparts for the most part, and in an area that matters to them. What matters to officers? Unit evaluations, right? So let's say during our culture mapping sessions, we'll get into that. Someone says something like, hey, awards and decorations are given to the folks in the good old boys club, like it's favoritism in this unit. We would capture that specific sentence, right, or that phrase. We would weight it on how positive or negative it is, and then we nest that under the strategic alignment category. And then the number of times we keep getting positives and negatives for the strategic alignment category is how we start turning that qualitative data into quantitative data.
Okay, so what it sounds like is that you're running a sentiment analysis over, however you get that qual to you, and then based on what that sentiment analysis outputs is how you're putting it into like each specific category. My follow-up question would be, are there specific weights to any of these, or are they all basically weighted the same? Is there priority given to any specific one?
It's going to be... Oh, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
And a follow-up question to that is, I am interested in the desire to gear this towards officers, because from my point of view, and Daniel could speak to my sentiment towards the structural differences between officer and enlisted, by measuring culture in a way that appeases to the sentiments of officers, you are appeasing to structures that don't necessarily apply to enlisted folks.
I can definitely see that perspective. When we get into like what does the final output look like, it's going to be in a way that enlisted will resonate with, right? We got two different versions of the graphs that we present up. One is like definitely the officer side, right? And the other one's going to be more of like, what is the specific thing that you need to work on? The goal, the output from the culture mapping is to try and be able to say, here's the areas you need to focus on. For like a flight, super simple, right? From the flight perspective, this is what you need to focus on. If it's a unit-wide one, then what areas does each flight need to focus on, and what areas does the senior enlisted leader need to focus on, and the commander? The frame, using the mile, managing resources, improving unit, leading people, executing mission. The goal is to give it a little bit more teeth so that we can get our foot in the door for some units that may not be as bought into actually getting after the cultural piece.
Yeah, to this point, I see there being two really important considerations. One of them is embedding the efforts that you're trying to do within the values of the people that have control, right? Like you need to nest it under their values, but you also don't want to privilege the existing structure since culture is in part modulated by structures, right? So if it turns out to be the case that privileging that structure is part of the problem, then there needs to be some consideration of both of those. There's like tension between those two ideas. You need to nest within your values, but also I need to consider whether your values need to be challenged, which is how I would phrase maybe the consideration there. Not everything, I don't think everything should come down to the assumption that the system as it is probably fine because people more powerful than us said so.
Yeah.
There should be the strategic choice to go, we might not be able to change the system because people more powerful than us own it. So maybe we have to strategically use their values, which is kind of what you're talking about here. But then if that's your only approach, then the assumption is that you'll never seek to change their values, right? So I think there needs to be some push and pull there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay. I definitely appreciate that. When we go through the specifics, definitely I would like you all to pick that point back up on once you see the full process. Does that still imbalance the approach? So real quick, I do want to do some very broad overview academics on one of the underlying diagnosis tools that we use. There's a book called Tribal Leadership. It breaks down team attributes into 5 different stages. Has anyone seen this before, the tribal leadership stages? Cool. Yeah, we'll just go through it super quick. This normally takes like 45 minutes to go through to give a good quality run through. So we're going to be burning through it in like 5 minutes. If you have any questions on it, please let me know, and then we'll go from there. Okay. There's 5 stages. Tribes are categorized between 20 to 150 members. So like, let's say you have a team of just 15 people or like 5 people. That is so small that it's really not big enough to be considered a tribe per se. So typically like a CSS, for example, CSSs have like 5 people. So when you look at that CSS, you expand their bubble out to the next group of folks that are closest to their work center. That gets them up to 20. Like maybe that's the command team with the first sergeant because they interact with the CSS so frequently. Or maybe you're a super small flight and there's another super small flight that you work with closely. You would consider both of those as potentials to be of the same tribe. If you have a unit that's over 150 people, it's not going to be one cohesive culture. It's going to start separating at that point. Typically, using the Air Force structure, every single flight could be considered its own tribe. So each flight's going to have a flight commander and a flight chief, and they're going to be setting their own paces. So like when we do this for a unit-wide organization, we typically say like, hey, typically each flight's going to be their own tribe. It's a super quick run through. The stages are tiered 1 through 5. You cannot skip over a stage, either going up or down the scale, and you do not remain stagnant. So like, let's say you're a stage 2, you can't just jump over stage 3 and get to a stage 4. The way you categorize a team on what stage there are is you look at the behaviors of a specific individual. You average out the type of language they use, the type of behaviorals you see. Like, hey, on some days I'm at a 2. Some days I'm at a, most of the time I'm at a 3. And then on good days I'm at a 4. So you just average out where on average is this individual. So you give them that number, and then you go across the team. If the team has a whole bunch of 3s and 4s and 2s, what is that number on average? And that's what that team's stage is. The tribal leadership stages set the foundation on the output recommendations that we provide to flights and units on how should you approach developing your folks. We've all heard like, hey, you got to meet somebody where they're at. You got to coach someone where they're at. This provides a good framework to be able to actually diagnose that on a more mathematical basis. Stage 1 is called, it's basically called Undermining. It is like the worst place to be. The book, the authors that did all the research to come up with this process, only 2% of all the teams they surveyed measured in on a stage 1. The key characteristic of a stage 1 is that the team lacks psychological safety. So that's like, when you go to work, you're afraid that you're going to be belittled, you're going to be put down either physically or verbally, right? It's not a good place to be. Stage 2, while the authors measured only 25% of the teams at this one, stage 2, in my experience in the Air Force, at the flight and squadron levels is much higher than 25%. It's key. The key attribute of it is apathetic victim. The main synopsis there, and on our website, we have basically summary notes. For folks at a stage 2, you're gonna have a lot of folks that feel like, hey, I gotta protect my people from the intrusion of management. I don't know if you all have heard that before, where you go in and you have like a crusty staff or tech, and they're like, like leadership comes in here and they mess up everything. So my job in life is to protect my people from leadership. I've definitely heard that a ton in my career. Little to no innovation, almost no sense of urgency. People talk as though they're disconnected from organizational concerns, do the minimum to get by, no initiative or passion. They cluster together in groups that encourage passive aggressive behavior while telling people in charge that they're on board. Here's my favorite one. When people are presented with new visions, the reaction is, we tried that before, it didn't work then, and it won't work now. And then the other one that I'm sure y'all in your positions have heard a lot. Let's see. I think I skipped it. Yeah, this one right here. The theme of the communication is that no amount of training or effort will change their circumstances, and giving up is the only enlightened thing to do. Like, hey, you want to come in here and innovate? You're just wasting your time. It's not going to work. Again, these aren't necessarily mean that these are bad people. It just means that their coping mechanisms for surviving in the environment that they're placed in have caused these types of behaviors to arise. The goal is not to say these are bad people. The goal is to say, here is an environment that has induced this type of behavior. It's a classic fundamental attribution error logical fallacy that we want to make sure that we articulate so that it's not people bashing. The goal is organizational design that mitigates these types of behaviors. Stage 3, I'm going to scroll back up. We're going to burn through the rest of this super quick. Stage 3 is these are going to be like your golden airmen that don't work well with other folks. They're super confident in their ability. They're like, hey, I'm not a victim. I can influence my environment, but no one else works as hard as me, or I just work better alone and nobody else like can functionally work with me as well. Stage 4, tribal pride. That's where the key difference here is where the folks start realizing, hey, I can be more effective if I start collaborating with folks. in order to make the team more effective, I can't do everything on my own. I need to start building these effective relationships. And then stage 5 is like, hey, we're crushing everything. We're not in competition with anyone. We're in competition with what's possible. Its key characteristic is it's not sustainable.
So I have a question that'll probably be answered by how you diagnose these stages.
Yeah.
Or I have a couple of questions. So if you could just really quickly describe the diagnostic process, and then I'll see if that answers it.
Okay, yeah. When you own the team, when you're a part of the team, it's easier because you get to see behaviors every day, right? When we provide this for other organizations, we've actually just started a new process that we're going to actually roll out today and see how effective it is. Oh no, let me get my screen. It's 2-part. Part 1 that we did historically was that we would base it off of what we would find in the culture mapping results. And we'll get into what those look like shortly, like the specific feedback notes. And we would look at those notes and try our best to say, from an outside observer's perspective, this is what I feel like. It's not overly accurate, right? Because it's a very quick blip, like, hey, this is where I think you're at. We're trying to incorporate a hybrid of, so here's an example. Today, we're going to be doing culture mapping for my flight because we're doing our 6-month mark round. When the folks come into the session, they're going to be given a QR code that's going to lead them to this survey. And we'll just burn through the survey now. And it's basically gonna, it's gonna hit a couple of points, but one of the last 20 questions of it are 4 questions apiece to try and measure if a stage 1 indicator exists, then a stage 2 indicator, then a stage 3 indicator, 4, and then 5. And then from there, we take the results that everyone's gonna input, and we try to do a more quantitative approach to measuring. So then we'll take the results from the survey, pair that up with the results from the in-person culture mapping, and then do our best to say, here's a better educated guess. And it's just a guess and an estimation, right? On where we believe the team is at. So based on where the team is at, we can then prescribe, here is a development strategy for how, given your flight specific situation, on how you can go about trying to take them from a stage 2 to a stage 3 or a 3 to a 4 based on the different developmental strategies for each team. Cool, so let's go back to that survey.
There's one point I want to insert here before I forget it, and it ties into something that Austin did for values generation that he called refactory. And I get this from, I think that you would get a lot from looking into the Cynefin company's approach to their mapping process for ethnographic information. They have a very, very thorough process for converting qualitative, what they call micro narratives, into quantitative data, which is what you're doing here. And they're very adamant about not having an external expert attempt to interpret qualitative information, like ethnographic information, for other people. Their process incorporates the people who generated that information doing the quantitative translation themselves. And the way that the Cynefin company does it is through this really interesting and weird process involving triangles. But I think you might be able to leap over this obstacle using something like Austin's refactory process or something similar that's a workshop approach to generating the ethnographic information, which you can do through surveys, although workshops are better in this regard. And then having the participants themselves make the quantitative assessment. So if you have identified, I think that in looking for particular flags indicating stages is a really interesting method, because I think that you're gonna get to this, but the idea of identifying like if these flags pop up, it's much more severe than if like stage 4 flags pop up, which would give you a prioritization framework, I'm imagining is what you're getting to. But that was just something that popped into my head. I don't know if Austin, you have anything to add to that.
I do, kind of a bunch.
Yeah.
Okay, where to start? We'll talk about surveys first. So what was in the design of this process? What was the intention with including the survey element?
Yeah, no, good question. So there are a couple data points that we want to capture that make sense to pair it up with the process. One of which is to, let me jump to the graphic. One of which is to solicit from the members what cultural preference they have, what type of work center. There's this great article by Harvard Business Review that talks about the 8 different types of company culture. So one of the data points that's super easy to calculate is what is the preference of the team, you know, on average for how they like to, you know, what type of culture do they like within their work center, and then asking them where do they actually feel like their work center culture is at, and then doing the same for flight leadership and squadron leadership, with the distance between, like, hey, if our preference is to operate in a work center culture that's more aligned with purpose and caring, but we're down in more of a authority and safety perspective, but then my boss talks to me about like, hey, we're here and it's all about enjoyment and learning, that's a misalignment with how the organization communicates. So part of the survey is to measure where do the team members feel like they're at. Then we add in the tribal leadership stage there as well. That's what that 2 represents. But where would they like to resonate? And how does that mesh up with how leadership communicates and how leadership sets priorities? So the survey, let me jump back to the survey, DOB culture map, that's a different one. Oh, can't see, there we go. Survey, what flight are you part of? What's your current grade? What's your AFSC? How many months to your DROS? The DROS question, I'll show you later on why we asked that one. Then we have 2 net promoter score questions. Basically, these 2 questions are how we're measuring job satisfaction. So the first one being, how likely are you recommend an assignment to the 8th Intel Squadron to a friend or colleague? Then the second question being, how likely you recommend placement within your immediate flight or team to a friend or colleague? The whole point of there is to measure job satisfaction. So we hit those with those 2 questions. This one right here, this is a test that we're running. This is our attempt to try and measure tribal leadership stage in 1 question. People get so many surveys and have to answer so many questions. We're kind of running this to see how well does the results from this 1 question line up from the next 20 questions that we have. Testing, right? Who knows? We'll see through these trials that we're running if it lines up. Then we have 4 questions here that pertain to, oh, I'm sorry. These next 4 questions are to measure what type of company culture do the individuals prefer to work in. Because the different words are opposite ends of that spectrum. Do you have something you want to say, sir?
I see a problem here.
Oh yeah, no, hit me.
Maybe I could be wrong. I could be wrong. But I cannot imagine an individual that would choose authority over purpose.
So
Just
maybe,
on a survey basis
yeah. So the,
or results over caring, right? Like,
yeah, if that's their preference, it's their preference, right?
well, more of what I'm saying is that I think it's biasing a certain option over the other rather than one being more valid. I think it is giving an implicit bias. Like, why would I not say caring when results is the other one? Why would I not say purpose when authority is the other one?
So I am curious where you got those specific dyads from.
Yeah, let me show you.
From the
Here's got a corporate culture.
because one of the things that the guy, the chief scientist for the Kinevin company, Dave Snowden, likes to point out are what he calls Manichaean dialectics. They are dichotomies that are intentionally privileging one, like one side is clearly the evil side. And the authors of this might not have presented it that way, but I actually think that the you know what does a good job of this is the what's the Project Mercury competing values framework, the one from the original, not like that they borrowed that from Quinn and whoever was the person who invented that. I think they do a good job of using language that doesn't privilege, but I do think that you might, for things like, you would be able to tell in your survey results if 99% of your survey results are always safety over authority, for example,
Sure.
you would know that you're using the wrong language. And I think that's a really important thing to watch out for. As kind of Austin pointed out, is a lot of times these things are presented with an agenda in mind. The authors might not present it as such, but I think that what they're actually saying is that safety is more important than authority, and then they're presenting it as though it's a personal preference. It just happens to be the case that 100% of the population prefers safety over authority.
Sure.
Right?
So would a good compromise be, instead of saying learning over safety, creativity and trying new things versus planning, caution, and preparedness?
I actually think that would be better.
Yeah, agreed that it would be better, but I think things along these lines, and I'm sort of expecting, no offense, to find more of these, to be more purposeful in the specific wording of a survey. And that's going to include things like, should we use these dichotomies? Yes, we are looking for them. Should we use them in the language of the survey? Because will it, like Daniel said, give a certain implicit preference to one option over the other?
Sure.
And the reason why I asked my initial question is because most of the time when surveys are used, they're not designed in such a way that elicits the best ethnographic results. They're often framed in a way that that primes the pump for very specific results,
Sure.
which means that your data is now skewed because of the way you asked the question. And it's very similar with doing interviews. It's really easy in an interview to skew, a question one way or the other as well.
Yeah.
So that was my main reason to ask the question about the design of the survey. To get to this point of like, surveys need to be like very carefully designed, or that qual or even that quant that you're trying to get is going to be skewed one way or the other.
I want to add that I really like what you're intending to do here, because I think it hits on a really super important point that there's no such thing as an ideal culture. The ideal is to create a culture that meets the preferences and needs and and the individual contexts of the people within it, which is going to change as the people change. So first identifying the cultural target through a preference. I think that I really like the idea. And it's actually really similar to, I hate personality tests, but one thing they do really well is they open up that conversation about that we have different preferences, and therefore we need to adapt our environment and our approach to whatever doesn't violate the preferences of the whole. The other thing I'm curious about, I think this is all super awesome, by the way. Like, I don't want our nitpicking to give you the wrong impression. I'm really excited about this, and so that's why I'm jumping in. And I lost my thought there. So
I do want to say I really appreciate the candor, and if you're holding back the candor, please don't.
Yeah.
So that means I'm listening, right?
No, for sure. So yeah, same with Daniel. Like I wouldn't be saying anything if I didn't care and if I didn't think this was a great thing to do, and that you're doing a great thing here.
Oh,
I'm only nitpicking because I'm like, yeah, this is an incredible idea that just needs nitpicking to continue along that path.
Cool. I'd be sad if y'all weren't picking. Okay.
The other thing I was going to say is that one of the dangers here and why Likert scales are often better than one or the other is because it will give you the opportunity to flag when people just hit the middle between these, which is a tendency that I would expect for something like learning and safety. Is if you asked me which I preferred, I'd be like, can I please have both?
Yeah.
In equal balanced measure. And if you force me to make a choice, then I'm skewing your results as though I think safety is not important at all, and learning needs to be dialed up to 100, which I think might not necessarily play out in the outcomes. But if you were to use a Likert scale or a sliding scale, you would at least be able to see when people were falling dead in the middle. Yeah, the proportionality is really important.
I think that makes a lot of sense to use a Likert scale for these, because it'd just be not the words, we'll drop the words, but we do creativity and trying new things on one side, and then planning, caution, preparedness on the other. And that makes a lot of sense. And that's easy to do. Okay.
I'm sorry, one more thing about the surveys. And then we can move on to the next thing. So I wanted to talk about some other implicit selection mechanisms, because the surveys are very prone to these.
Yeah.
In this case, I'm wondering, how do you guarantee, first, when this survey hits a flight, for example, how is it just like whoever wants to take it takes it? Because if that's the case, then only people who care to take.
Was it 90%
right?
likes taking surveys, 2% doesn't? Yeah. No, I was just seeing that today. So the forcing mechanism that we're using is, instead of blasting out to the unit or the flight saying, hey, please take this when you get a chance. When the folks walk into the culture mapping session, like today when we do ours, and this is super timely. Fortunately, we haven't started this round yet, so I can make the adjustments y'all are providing now. But when they walk into the room, we're gonna have a paper with a QR code on it. And we're gonna hand it to everyone and say, hey, take out your phone, go to the survey, fill it, so that theoretically we'll have the folks that normally would not have taken the survey take it in the moment. That is the goal for making sure that it's not the 98% like surveys and 2% doesn't.
Yeah, so how about, I guess the next mechanism would be like, so do you just force everybody to go to the culture mapping session?
Yeah, the goal is for the unit-wide one is a 30% random sample.
So who's guaranteeing that random sample?
Yeah, there's so many all we can do is say, please send random folks, but at the end of the day, there's gonna be biases in it. But you all are helping us find areas we can reduce the bias. That's like, we know it's not gonna be perfect per se, but we wanna get to
For
it
sure.
close as perfect as possible. It's a lot of personalities that we're going to try and work with the coach and like, hey, please make sure it's random, this many folks, this many demographics. The culture mapping sessions, the other complexity is, try and separate the airmen from the NCOs so that folks can feel more open to providing, true responses.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, if this were to be a academic paper on the culture within our flight and the culture within our unit, I don't think it would pass per se, but we can get close, and we can get close enough that we can start having more accurate targets versus me walking in and saying, I look at my flight, I know what the problems are. Hey, Jimmy, do my problems match your problems? Cool, let's solve it. Yeah.
I just had a really interesting thought. One of the exercises that I like to do on like Miro boards and stuff is to put a scale and then have people simultaneously place their results on that scale. I've never seen it done with really substantive stuff like you're talking about here. I've seen it more with regards to like fun games of preference between two extremes. I don't think it would necessarily be wise to have people make their assessment between two polarities simultaneously because of the amount that they would influence one another's answers. But I do think it would be interesting to have them generate their personal responses and then do an activity where they simultaneously map those responses together onto a scale. So
Okay.
for example, and what that would look like in practice would be something along the lines of giving everybody a single dot to put on a physical scale on a board in front of them so that they could actively see what the preference of the group was and or what the spread of the group was, because that kind of thing reveals like probably the process that you're doing behind the scenes, but when you bring people into that kind of work, it will make it could potentially make some of that later work easier because they'll be aligned to what that all meant, like what their personal preferences look like in aggregate. So it's just like something that I would be tempted to experiment with, not necessarily, I don't even necessarily know if it would work or it would have the desired outcome, but it's something worth considering. If you put these polarities up on the board in front of people and allow them to place themselves along it simultaneously.
Makes sense. It's definitely something to look at in smaller teams, definitely. Yeah, the complexity that we have to navigate through is doing this for 30% of 360 people is a lot. But when I do my flight and I want more accurate responses, I'm going to be a lot more willing to spend more time on it, right? It's like when I do my flight level ones, it's 100% of everyone that does this, not just a 30% sample.
And there's a when I brought up the refactory exercise, which we didn't explain to you.
I definitely wrote that down. Definitely interested in it.
Basically, the process is starting with an abstraction, which is what you have here. You have these abstractions related to, some of these polarities that you think are important for measuring culture. But then when people choose one of those abstractions as like, this is a really important one to me, there's then a process of disinfiquation because a single word is going to mean different things to different people. So you start with that. Actually, ideally, you'd start with the ethnographic and then you'd turn it into abstract. But if you need to start with abstract, it's then important to turn it into, well, what does that word mean to you? So that the group can disambiguate what they meant when they said that learning was more important than safety.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if that means two vastly different things to two of those different members, then part of your process needs to include bringing those abstractions into alignment so that you know what it means to try and act on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. Cool. All right, so we're gonna burn through the rest of this survey. There's those 4 questions for the personal level. Then we ask 4 more about what is currently the priority within your work center. Again, we'll drop the front part of the word, put in a Likert scale. And then the next 20 questions are designed to try and measure the tribal leadership level. So it sets of 4 each. So like this very first one, how often do you feel like a supervisor or immediate leadership didn't have your best interest in mind when addressing concerns or needs raised by you or another team member? It's getting after that psychological safety, right? Would you all recommend a Likert scale on this one as well, or?
What I would actually recommend for these.
Yeah, because they're all structured like this, the very often, sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, the ideal in my mind for measuring this, what is ethnographic information about the lived experience of these, you know, of members, would be to have them generate the adjectives, and ideally, and this is because I'm like such a advocate of the micro-narrative approach, it would be every culture mapping approach that I've seen that I really, really liked started with a very open prompt that was like, tell a story about a time when you felt unsafe.
Okay.
And the reason that it's that and not how often do you feel unsafe is because people might have vague impressions of, you know, the general environment, but what's really important is what's embedded in the stories about that environment. So, and that's where you're going to get the most useful information. Like, you would get the frequencies based on what stories people decided to tell, essentially, because that would be where the red flags are. I don't necessarily think that this approach wouldn't work. I think you could raise, like you could get a qualitative analysis of how people feel about their work center with a series of these types of questions. But my tendency is to go, instead of what you've done is you've jumped straight into a quantitative analysis of specific abstractions, which people might, my experience with surveys is that I often don't relate to the abstractions that they put in front of me. Like the words they picked don't mean anything to me. And so I often find myself wishing they had picked the specific abstractions that work for me, which is impossible for them to know what they would be. Or they had just given me a blank field to tell a story or to share my impressions in a narrative way.
I feel like we should have warned you that we're very qual heavy.
Oh, this is
line of thought.
How often do you get to have, well, I guess for you all the time, but how often do you get to have this type of feedback, right? So I do really appreciate it. Like my brain is like trying to keep up with you on that. That's good. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm happy to continue. I'm actually gonna have to jump off here pretty quick, but I'm happy to.
If you got to jump off real quick, and I'm going to hunker down and burn through the culture mapping process so you can see it, and then show you like what do we want to provide, and then we'll go back to questions. That way you don't miss out. Okay. Brain freeze. Okay. So the actual culture mapping process This is the culture mapping tool that we use. It's from Strategizer, which I believe you both are familiar with, or all of you should be familiar with. These are the actual question prompts that we use. We try to do groups of 6, between the 3 to 6 participants. We don't want any smaller than 3, and we don't want any more than 6. The preference is to have 2 facilitators. One facilitator to take point when asking these questions. The other one is to basically make sure that first facilitator doesn't get tunnel vision and folks aren't disproportionately participating. You have the 6 folks, you bring them in, you let them know like, hey, we're going to do this culture mapping activity. This is after they've done that survey. This very first tier, outcomes, is essentially an icebreaker. The facilitator is going to ask, what are the outcomes from the work that you do every single day? What are the results that you see? These are real world examples that we've gotten from sessions, or for one specific session. The responses don't always match the question, which is so interesting, but we get responses like, hey, the result of my hard work is a paycheck, or the result of my hard work is we answer key intelligence questions. We save American lives. We had one where results of my hard work is I'm rewarded with more hard work. That one, a little bit insightful if it's not just, for fun. Results of hard work, we win awards. It's a good icebreaker because it introduces what is the flow, what is the process, and it gets the folks involved. The facilitator will have a stack of Post-it notes and a marker. And when a participant responds, they hand them that marker and that Post-it note. They write down the response after they say it out loud on the Post-it note, and they slap it on the wall. The placement of the Post-it notes are going to mirror the format that you see in front of you. It's going to be anything that is at the same tier, they'll put together, but they'll space them out across, like if they're a different category, then they'll be placed differently or separated. From there, they go into behaviors. Some of the questions for behaviors are, what does a good day within the work center look like? And people will share stories or whatnot. They'll get that Post-it note, they'll write down an abbreviated form of whatever their input is, and they'll place it on the board. So what does a good day look like? What does a bad day look like? Why do we behave in these certain ways? One of the questions is, if our work center was a movie, what movie would it be? Like, what movie scene would it be? To try and get a more of like a descriptive, something that you can associate with a little bit easier, like Office Space, right? Like, we are Office Space. Again, here's some real world examples of responses that we get. I blanked out the top part, but the goal is to tier them underneath similar categories. The goal is to start building a running narrative that we connect with those lines. And the analogy I use is like when you have a string on your uniform, if you're to pull that thread to try and get deeper into that thread, that line of thought, the goal is to pull out the narrative. So again, here's some real world examples. We've started color coding positive versus negative just to make it easier for when we provide these slides to the leadership of the teams that for the folks to go through. Like you see busy work on here, duplication of efforts, too many meetings. Feel good when there's something to actively work on. When we beat NGA, real world impacts, bad days when there's not enough computers. It's been common for us. Computer space is tough. Admin game on point. Yeah. No formal training. Training always sucks. And then the very last one, the last tier, enablers and blockers. This is where you go and you point to a specific Post-it note within the behaviors tier and you say, what enables this behavior to happen? What are leaders saying or doing that enables this behavior to happen? The goal is to try and get the members to do root cause analysis on their work center, as opposed to providing it up and letting someone else to try and do the root cause. Yeah. So that is the culture mapping facilitation process. The facilitator takes a picture of all the Post-it notes on the wall. They go back and transcribe it onto a PowerPoint slide that looks just like this, and they send it up. We just started doing the adding in the major graded areas with that Google form. I'm a little concerned on this process. Definitely would love your thoughts. I'm concerned because we're trying to use the second facilitator while they try and make sure that, you know, they don't have tunnel vision. They're going to be filling out this Google form. So the very first question is, what's the input? Whatever goes on that post note goes into this field. So that means they have to type it out real time while the session is going. Next question is positive or negative? Using Likert scale, the goal is to ask the members like, hey, how positive or negative is this on a scale of 1 through 5? To let the members say, well, you know, it's kind of like a 4. It's positive, but not super positive. Added in, like, I'm going to print out these graphics so that the second facilitator has it in front of them, but we added in here as well, just to double tap. And then we have the categories for them to select and submit, with an other being at the bottom. If they can't, if it's like, hey, this is too much happening real time, I'm just going to hit the other and hit submit. Worst case, I go in after the fact and do my best to pick a category. On the printouts we're going to hand them, we did highlight all the fields that are included. We did not include every single sub field because it's too much. To be honest, this list is too much, but we wanted to get that fidelity for some of the final products that we're going to be providing, so that it's tangible. If I just say, hey, your stewardship is bad, well, what stewardship? Or if I say strategic alignment is really bad, it needs to be addressed, what's specifically within strategic alignment? Like awards program, that's a weird one to be underneath strategic alignment, right? So for certain fields, we wanted to have that higher fidelity. The main goal of doing this process right here is scalability. When we have entire units that do this, having someone go in after the fact and try and transcribe post-it notes into these categories is super tough. So the goal is to try and move it closer. Again, the main concern is, can a second facilitator keep up with the flow of the process? It's cool if they slow it down, but if they slow down the process too much with the culture mapping, then it will impact the responses, right? So I know you got to run. I know you all have thoughts. We're gonna run real quick into.
No, it's okay. I actually have a suggestion potentially.
Sure.
So one way that we do things from a facilitative point of view is that we usually have people cluster their own sticky notes in certain buckets. And this is, first of all, that's too much for anybody to do real time. And so if there is a sticky note for each point already, I feel like you can just throw in an intermediary step in there to be like, hey, here are the 4 categories. And now you, as a group of 6 or however many, categorize them into these buckets and then have them fight over which bucket it goes in for a while. And that's going to be, that's own interesting dynamic of like, no, actually it goes over here with the M, or, oh, it goes over here with the E. Eventually it'll settle out. But then you have it categorized, and all you need to do is then record that output.
So one of the recommendations we got was that the members do it on their phone and then do the post-it note. But it sounds like if we still leave it with the second facilitator, but when they ask like, hey, how positive or negative is this? And then ask, hey, where would you categorize this on this chart? Is that kind of like what you're suggesting? Like add that into the facilitation process?
It's kind of what John's saying is like, instead of like putting the onus on a facilitator or for you after the fact, just throw that whole burden onto the participants. So if you can get them to, sort them into those buckets in some type of way. I personally just prefer the easy sticky note way of like, you already have a sticky note.
Yeah.
All you need to do is just move that and like have this place for like the buckets. Like now it's in this bucket. And so people can like physically feel it being in that bucket or in that category of things.
Yeah.
If the severity for prioritization purposes is really important, one, I'm wondering how many things you're going to expect to try and prioritize, because one method you could do with another facilitator is you have them generate the categorizations, right?
Yeah.
Part of generating categorizations is going to involve disambiguation of what that sticky note means, right? among the participants. And during that disambiguation, there's going to be decomposition to new ideas. So allow them to generate new content as they're doing that process.
Okay.
And then as they were generating those items that you need to be prioritized on a severity scale, I would have a second facilitator create new sticky notes for each of those items and have a space set aside specifically just for a severity scale discussion. And it would be, I would recommend figuring out a way to do it on a 2x2 rather than a simple severity. Usually we do severity scale or something along those lines, like, or how severe is this problem? How much does it affect mission is another way. You can come up with a 2x2, and then it would be a process of, once they had completed the categorization process, okay, we've taken all of these items and we put them next to our 2x2. Now you will need to come to a consensus about what the severity is for each of them. If like, that's a pretty common move for a facilitated idea generation. It's like ease versus impact and feasibility. Like, there's a lot of things you can do. I generally do 2x2s rather than just a single scale though.
Okay. So that makes sense. Use positive and negative.
And then I don't know if you saw my comment in the chat. I was thinking about it, about your process that you use a survey for. If you want to get thicker ethnographic data, the ideal in design and also culture work is to do interviews, right?
Sure.
Interviews give you thick ethnographic data, and it also gives you the opportunity in that conversation to have them give you their qualitative, quantitative, interpretation. One method of doing that in a distributed manner would be to have the teams that you are doing this for offer up a tribute of a small team, a small percentage of their people, to be trained in an interview method that then they execute on their own people. That way, if not all on your facilitators to do a bunch of interviews, you could also use it as an opportunity to teach them the value of the interview process. And it could be I honestly think you could accomplish really, really great data on each of those polarities with as short as a half-hour interview. Using a pre-built interview guide, but in a conversational setting, it gives you the ability to disambiguate and for them to expound on the abstractions that they're handing you.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, and so to sort of go back to the more abstract point of what Daniel's making here, I think a lot of efforts try to, like, hey, we make this point qualitative so that it matters to people. And I get that people like numbers, but in large part, numbers can almost mean anything that you want them to. And so but qual is really good, quant is really good at, getting getting a big set of numbers about a specific thing, right? And Daniel's talking about the thickness that qual is able to give you. And that thickness is like more about the why versus the what is going on, or how much of this thing is going on. And what it feels like from my perspective of hearing this so far is that you want to bore down into specific whys of this culture of this specific place. And so the thicker that you can get your qualitative data by doing interviews, by doing observations, if it's relevant to your task, but it doesn't seem super relevant here. But doing these types of ethnographic practices that gets you that depth of why, I think will lend better credence, that is also accompanied with quant, right? It's like, here's what's happening, right? Here's why things are happening. And then here's the quant to support it, instead of sort of the opposite, where it's like, yeah, here's all the quant and we have a little bit of qual to suggest that, like, it feels like you want to go the opposite way of like, here's this thick amount of this qual, here are the stories that are supporting what is going on in these flights, like what is the experience, what is, what are the problems, what are the good things, what are the bad things, what are, all those in betweens, right, that you can only get with qualitative data, and then to use quant to support those stories.
No, that makes sense. I'm going to go through the presentation that we're going to be trying out for the first time to try and show at the flight level and then the squadron level, what are the deliverables that we're providing back. And again, I'll show you how we're trying to still provide some of that qualitative data that definitely has room to add in like interviews and such. Okay, no, I really appreciate it. This is good. All right, so intro slide, nothing fancy.
I gotta jump off. I'm really looking forward to watching the video though.
Yeah.
So it's recording to your computer, right?
So I'll figure out how to upload it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and then I think this would be great to share in the Agitare YouTube if you're willing. This is solid stuff. Thanks so much for putting this on, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with the rest of the community.
No, I definitely appreciate it, and definitely looking forward. Like today's culture mapping sessions, not a whole lot's gonna pivot, but we are trying to go through and keep improving the processes as we go. And it's good that we're getting this now, so that when we have the rest of the flights with our unit go through it, there might be more that we can incorporate for them. Cool. Thanks so much. And for everyone else's time, we're gonna burn through the rest of the slides in here. So that, I know you're allocating a lot of time toward this, and I appreciate it. I don't want to take advantage of that.
Hey, John, am I coming through clear?
You are, yes, sir.
Okay, cool. My Wi-Fi has been killing me. I've been kicked like 10 times.
Oh, no.
So I do have a question. So are we focused on qualitative data, or are we using any questions that are psychology backed, right? Because I'm looking at your questions, and the Likert scale, I mean, it's usable. The Rash model is also applicable, I think, based on like what you're trying to really gather. But I asked about the psychology method because you can answer or you can reduce the amount of questions that you have if you use a psychological profile context and how you phrase your question. As Daniel pointed out earlier, it's all about how you phrase the questions. If you phrase it the right way, you can really derive a lot of information. And so I'm just curious, is it strictly qualitative, quantitative data that you're trying to extrapolate, or are you looking to also get into the minds of those that you're surveying?
Wouldn't that also be a combination of qual and quant? Though not to deny your point, just I don't think there's a distinction there necessarily. Just having like the psychological profile I don't know if it would necessarily be neither qual or quant. If you get what I'm saying, John.
Yeah, no, fair point, Austin. Right, that's why I was just curious. Are we strictly sticking with the data analytics side, or is there some kind of behavioral analysis input? That's what I'm getting at.
Everything's on the table. I do not have a background in psychology or behavioral science. So what we've been doing is trying to keep whatever questions we ask, whatever measuring points we have, something that we can cite back to some sort of document that was done by someone that does have that background. So the challenge there is we want to hit everything we can, right? But I don't want to stray too far away where I'm using content that I can't cite, right? Like the questions on like what type of company culture do you have? I'm not going to use verbiage that is not provided by that organization or those SMEs that built that, because that would I don't feel comfortable getting too far out of there, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely does. And what you said kind of made me think of my earlier question, which is, as far as when we're doing this within the organization, are you incorporating like the vision?
One of the goals is I've done mission, vision, value statement workshops before to help teams build their own. And in my experience, what happens a lot is a team will take a
Those
funding.
leaders within that unit, as far as how they're trying to,
Like, how are they trying to get towards their vision? Can you ask the question one more time?
We might have lost him again. I do have a lot to say about mission and vision, but that might have to be saved
we've
for
done
another
missions with them
time.
like that, but I miss them. Like, so I'm at a test.
You're going in and out, other John.
I'm going to burn through the rest of these slides, and then we should have that way, because after these slides, that's basically everything. Then we can have a better conversation. Well, you have a more holistic picture, so we can have a better conversation. Cool. Favorite quote, always good to start. First one is just a snapshot. Again, where is the team's preference? That doesn't mean we have to be within the team's preference. The goal is just to show where a possible friction point could be if the current way that the team feels like they're at has a significant opposite end of where they would like to be. And if where they're currently at has a lot of distance between where the flight leadership is trying to direct the team, then that could be a friction point. The key thing here is we're not trying to tell flights and teams how to run their teams. What we're trying to do is just to say, here's some possible friction points. We do talk about mission, vision, value statements. If you don't have one, maybe it makes sense to set some, because that can better align with where your team is at. If you're messaging, if I come in and I say, hey, I'm all about setting up a learning environment where you can go out and take risks, but then through my processes and actions, if I'm operating down here, that's a friction point. Then it's like, I hear you saying this, but we're operating differently. The goal of this graph is just to show where possible friction points could be to help leadership try and better align their processes and their talking points, language they use. Added in the tribal leadership level to, again, try and reinforce. If you have a team that's at a stage 2, don't throw them in a commander's call and hope that whatever you say in there is going to make any type of impact, because commander's calls don't work with stage 2 teams. Just an example of utility that we're trying to drive from this slide. Why are we doing this? Good quote from that Harvard Business Review article, overview. Methodology, we're building all this through the assessments that we send out to our folks right before they do the culture mapping sessions. We have a much shorter one that we send out to all your flight chiefs, flight commanders, squadron leadership, where they basically say, for your team, where are you trying to take your team? That's how we build that point, and then the actual in-person culture mapping sessions. Quick overview of all the 8 types. We do a little blue box for whichever 2 closely resemble where the team is at. It's just to say, hey, this is where we estimate your team to be at based on all the data, where you're currently operating. Net promoter score, using those 2 questions there, scale of 1 through 10. That D-Rose question that we had in there, there is another unit that did this. This is data from one of their net promoter score surveys they did, mapping out like, hey, where's the satisfaction levels with all their, across the different demographics within their team. For them specifically, they found that folks that are 6 months within 2 months of PCSing, like their job satisfaction would take a pretty significant dip. So then they could use more tailored processes to be able to say, how can we get after folks that are about to PCS because their quality of life is tanking, based on the net promoter score. We don't do a whole lot on the tribal leadership. It's just a quick explanation based on what we measured. This is where we believe your team is at based on these types of indicators. Here's the development strategy. Again, we're not trying to tell flights how to run their teams. We're just saying based on what we were able to measure, however accurate it is, this is where we believe your team is at. And this is what we believe is the best development strategy based on the content academics we have. Major graded areas, this is where we're trying to line up the responses with culture mapping based on the frequency of positive versus negative for each category. If you're just sum everything up for that big CGO perspective, the FGO, this is where you need to put your attention on, generically speaking, super broad, definitely for the O audience. This is where we get into specifics. This slide is a new variant that we are trying out, but the content on it is real world from an actual unit. Basically, the further up to the top left you get is the higher frequency that this specific thing was highlighted as negatively impacting the unit versus on the right-hand side, higher that was noted as really positive within the unit. Now for this unit specifically, they're based out of Korea. You know what, this isn't real world data. I adjusted it a bit. One of the things they had on there was continuity. Continuity was something that was highlighted as really negative for this unit, but it's Korea. How well are you really going to get after continuity in Korea? So how much from a unit organizational perspective, how much resources should you allocate towards it? Accounts, a lot of accounts are done by, support units, right? Now that might be a leadership lane, but it's all about based on your flight or based on your unit, whatever, one this is for. If this is for the flight level or unit level, let the teams decide where they want to put their weight. These are the things that we measured as the most negative and positive. This is where that categorizing based on those major graded areas comes into play. Then we provide the raw results from each session for each flight. The goal here is to provide that qualitative context. This is really the only format we're using to get after the qualitative piece. Definitely could add in interviews afterwards to give more fidelity on specific things. But you can see like here, this is fictional, right? Not fictional, this is a real world slide, but it came from a team that was like, hey, we're getting a ton of awards and it's great, but we're forced to do 12/6s and we don't like that. So you can kind of see like the different dynamics within the team. Like, yeah, they know they're winning stuff. They don't like necessarily the processes behind that, up to the unit leadership or that flight leadership to determine how they want to go through that. And then you would do it for each, there would be one slide for each session that goes through. You can see like the naming convention in the top. That's me plotting out for when I do my flight. So I have a placeholder for them. And then this is our one slide to try and hit everything all at once. Top right-hand box is where our very broad recommendations are going to go. It's mostly going to be what is that development strategy for that tribal leadership level. If there's a lot of misalignment on the left-hand side here versus where the team is at, what the team is doing, where the leadership is going, if there's a lot of misalignment there, then we'll do recommendations on that mission, vision, values, and how does the team leadership communicate, right? If you have a flight chief that's on one end and a flight commander that's on another end, that's a misalignment. So the goals are just to highlight misalignments and provide those types of recommendations. We're not trying to get in the business of, let me tell you how to do your flight. That smaller version of the mile, mission, managing resources, improving unit, leading people, executing the mission, and then the strengths and weaknesses, that is a much smaller condensed version of this slide right here in a much more digestible, quicker format, all in one slide. And that's it. That is the culture mapping process that we're trying to roll with. For a unit level, we would just plot out where are the different flights and where are the tribal leadership stages. Flights don't have to be in the same spot, but the squadron leadership needs to know where their flights are at. And if they're at a lower tribal leadership level, then maybe that means they provide a little bit more coaching to that flight leadership.
Okay, so I have a question about what specific recommendations might people see as an output for this?
So this is our first time running with this format, our first time using this 8 company culture types. Off the cuff, again, the goal is to keep it academic based and not to go in and say, hey, I'm smarter on how to run a flight, so let me tell you how to do your job. So the goal is to keep it very specific to maybe talking about some of the weaknesses here that might be caught on the, with more of that qualitative background on the raw culture mapping slides, the raw results slides. But even that has to be super careful with how we communicate that. The main focus is going to be the tribal leadership development strategies. Like, hey, if you're at a stage 2, it's all about one-on-one coaching. If you don't have a solid staff sergeant corps, because that's where the rubber meets the road for one-on-one coaching, is the staff sergeant corps, right? If they're not actioning that now, then it's all about how you're developing your techs, how you're developing your staffs, what are your master sergeants doing, trying to keep it to specifically there. And then any misalignments with, if a team does have a mission, vision, value statements, and they're operating, you know, on one end of the spectrum of this graphic, but their values are on the opposite end of the spectrum, that's a misalignment, right? So then that's just, hey, we recommend doing a revamp of your mission, vision, values. If a team doesn't have mission, vision, values, and it shows that they're misaligned in different areas, then we would make that recommendation.
Yeah, so this goes to a point that I think Daniel mentioned, like hinted at a little bit, or talked about a little bit, I should say, where I think one of the ways you can get around like being afraid of like saying, hey, do this, is by having the participants in the flight themselves prioritize which ones are more important to them. And then all you have to be is like, people in your flight said this, right? They can't be mad at you. They can just be like, yeah, people on your flight said the biggest priority thing is, I don't know, communication. And so our recommendation to you is to fix how you communicate, because this is the highest voted thing. This is the priority to your people. And that's why Danny was talking about like certain ways to prioritize them on like a 2x2 matrix of like what's feasible, what's desirable, so on and so forth. That all being said, yeah, I absolutely love this project. I'm really excited to see where it goes. Interesting how you mentioned mission vision in this sort of thing. I have very particular opinions about vision statements that a lot of people don't
negative.
have. No.
Okay.
I'm in the other camp. I'm in the other
Okay.
camp. I think vision statements could be really powerful. However, I think the Air Force is really bad about doing them. Not just in doing them at all, but in doing them in a effective way.
Deliberately, right?
Right.
So I've done and seen a lot of flights do, you know, MVOS, mission, vision, values, objectives, and key results strategy. And over half of them would basically turn into, we had a fun day. We did a whole lot of game storming and design thinking practices and made these really cool things. We put it on a pretty slide, and that was the end of it. Nothing else followed.
So I come to vision from a future studies perspective. And I won't go super in depth today because we're already over the time that I think we had scheduled. But the idea from a future studies perspective about vision is there's a futurist back in the 60s called Fred Pollock, and he did a study which some people, you know, say that there are some methodological problems with it, but I think that it's still valid from a very felt perspective. And what he said was that the rise and fall of a civilization is directly related to how positive or negative the people in that civilization's visions were, their visions of the future, right? So if a civilization was feeling particularly negative and they expressed that vision, you know, in art and, you know, in novels and so on and so forth in a negative fashion, that usually predicted the downfall of that civilization, which does say something about our current age, but it's fine, I won't talk about that too hard.
Well, that makes sense when you look at like, you know, when we put a man on the moon, right? Because that was the booming days, right? But
yes.
Now we're
no. So actually, JFK's vision is a really good example of what a really good vision can do, right? He said, "Man on the moon by X time," and then people just scrambled to do it. They were like, "There's no way we can do it" at first, but people just scrambled to get it done, and lo and behold. But where military vision statements mostly get things wrong is that it's not attached to anything, right? It's not attached to an experience of what it would be like to achieve that vision. And that's where future studies does a really good job, where it's like, hey, where do you want your organization to be in X amount of years from now, in 20 years from now, 30 years from now, right? And you go through like a number of exercises to do that, and we can talk details about how that's exactly accomplished. But you get the whole group, this whole squadron or this whole flight, for example, to be a part of this process. And so people are doing collective vision making now. Like, oh yeah, in 20 years we want this flight to be like this or to be like this. And then you sort of combine those visions of the future based on some trends that are happening in the present and patterns that are happening that are emerging. And then you basically do a process, what it's called backcasting, where it's like, okay, if we want this to be our vision of the future 20 years from now, then what has to be true, for instance, 15 years from now in order to get to 20 years from now, and so on and so forth, until you're like, okay, tomorrow, in order to get to 20 years from now, what do we need to do? And I think that's a really powerful way to bring that all together. And that's what I practice and what's been effective for me so far.
Backcasting, future studies, these are all new terms for me today, and that's cool.
I've
Makes sense.
been trying to be very deliberate about bringing futures studies and just futures practices in general to people.
Yeah.
I have a course ready-ish called Futures 101 that I plan on teaching people in the Air Force about at some point, which is all about this process.
Okay. Futures 101.
Yeah, Futures 101. Stand by on the Agitare channel and you'll see me talk about it at some point.
Cool.
I have the structure. I just need to like actually design like Miro boards of what I want it to be felt like. But yeah, oh yeah, thanks. I know John's talked about.
Yeah, I saw the message. I was like, oh, I didn't even talk about that. Yeah. One of because that's a great point. And that goes back to like when you do these cool things, how do you make it not just a fun day where you did a bunch of stuff and you talked about feelings and then you go home, right? Objectives and key results. We super love that concept. It's super simple, and like work breakdown structures mirror that framework as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so OKRs is a good example. I've actually introduced them into my futures practice for exactly that reason, because another way that you can replace doing a lot of backcasting is by using a objectives and key results type framework. I don't know if you're familiar with Measure What Matters, but
yeah,
the book that introduced objectives and key results.
Yeah,
and so you could kind of use it like a combination of like backcasting with objectives and key results to be like, okay, we want to get here in a year. So, okay, we need to be measuring these things with this result, so on and so forth. And so you can basically do backcasting along with objectives and key results for a very robust path forward.
No, that makes sense. The way that we used it in here, this is a flight level way forward. Unit level, it'd be up to the senior enlisted leader, like, right, whatever format. We would recommend a similar model, but it's basically you would go through the raw culture mapping results while we're gonna provide those categories of like, hey, based on what we categorized everything, this is where it's at. We do recommend at the flight level or squadron level for them to go through that raw data and pick out themes that they find patterns in. The only exception is anything relating to like dignity and respect. If that hits, like, if you see like one thing there, do you really wait for a pattern? Like, no, like I wouldn't. Following the objectives key results, we only recommend teams to pick out 3 to 5 themes. Any more than that, can you really get after it all? Up top in the green are some of the quotes that you would find in there on the positive side. Like, here's some of the positive things. This is a real world slide right here, used And on that flight culture mapping case study slide, this one's on there, and you can see like the raw results again 6 months later after the fact. On that note, one of the key things there is there's a ton of red on that 6 months in the future, but a lot of the red is nothing to do with the problem statements that were identified previously. That was my team. We had some really bad problems, as you can see on here. We put a lot of effort on fixing those problems. And in the process of fixing those problems, a lot more blind spots opened up. So what we like to do is culture mapping every 6 months. It's not a one and done. And like when I got those raw results from 6 months after we did the process, that was literally my report card. How well did you lead this team? We started off with a baseline. It wasn't a good one at all. When we measured the progress we made at the end of the 6 months, it was only like, it wasn't a big increase on the tribal leadership stage. We were still at a 2 when before we were at like a high 1, low 2, but progress, right? And a lot of those like really bad areas we resolved. So what we do is you pick 3 to 5 themes. The themes here are communication, feedback and psychological safety, and micromanagement. That is our objective. Our objective is to get after those. And that's much more watered down than what objectives should be. But it's simple. Scalability is the main name of the game in this. We want to be able to use something that's lightweight, that's effective. Problem statements, they're not the problem statements are basically the measures of success. Can we mitigate these specific things that are articulated on here? And then the ways forward are the ways that we're going to get after them. The way we would work is the flight leadership would identify the 3 to 5 themes. In a NCO calls, what we recommend is where the flight leadership would say, hey, we want to get after communication. Without showing the raw results, the team would identify, they would build problem statements for that theme. The main reason why we don't share the raw results is because we don't want to put folks on the defensive. Like, let's say I'm one of the people that is contributing to this problem within the flight. My goal as a leader would be, I want to get that person to be part of the solution. And not every situation is the same, but the goal is to get that person in the room and helping define the problem and helping build the solutions. So that'll be the next phase, is to build problem statements to define every single problem that the team wants to get after within those themes. And then in another session, because problem statements take a long time to build, the next session is, let's get the NCOs in the room. It could be airmen as well, depends on the team. Well, let's have them build the ways forward to mitigate those problem statements. Going back to the tribal leadership stages, if you're at a stage 2, the best way to move a person from a stage 2 to a stage 3 is one-on-one coaching. And what better way to do that than for them to say, here's a problem I identified, I helped define it, I helped define the way forward, and now I'm getting one-on-one coaching through the process of mitigating that problem statement. That is how we're trying to use the whole system to come back and try and take a flight and progress them forward. Unit level, it'd be definitely different. So this is more of the micro level. Unit level is going to be all about like senior enlisted leader and what do they want to get after and what can they do from like a educational perspective, what can they do from a process perspective without being overbearing on the flights.
Yeah, that's good to see. Unfortunately, I'm out of time for today. It was nice being here to talk about this, to sort of dig into the depths of what's here. I will say I am open to doing this again for things that we might have missed or didn't cover. So I'll extend that offer for myself, and I'm sure Daniel would be on board to do the same thing. So if you are ever if you ever have the desire to do something like this again, feel free to reach out, and I'm sure we'll be able to do something similar again.
I like it. It sounds like after we do, I don't know if like our whole unit, but maybe after my flight's done doing our culture mapping stuff and some of this isn't as theoretical, like that last PowerPoint we went through, that might be a good opportunity to circle back and say, hey, got a lot of great notes from y'all. We incorporated a lot of things. We're ready for another vector check.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I really appreciate it.
Of course. I'm glad to help.
Take it easy, Austin.
All right, take it easy.
Take care, boss.
Yeah, I mean, this is a super ambitious and bold thing to do. I mean, there's so much data that you guys are gathering, which is great. So I love it. I think you're getting after some of the really important things to help, units, flights really understand, what's going on. So that's really cool. It's really great. Yeah, I like it. I wish that this was kind of, I mean, I wonder how we can get more people trained to do this, right? It's great. You're going to do it for your flight. You can do that for other flights in your squadron. And I know there's tons of resources out there, that people could, go out and read and pick this stuff up. But I wonder how we could get this to, spread across the Air Force as, a thing, right? Organizational design, right? In terms of a skill, a specialty that people could learn and pick this up and somehow get certified or something like that in it. Maybe an SEI or something like they're doing with, the innovation SEIs that Morpheus is rolling out, right? Awesome. How do we do that for something like this for organizational design and get people to do this? Because right now, the Air Force, the only way to do this is the Air Force goes and pays Gartner, Deloitte, or some other big, consulting company to come in and do this for them. And that's just not sustainable in terms of, finances, to get that done at the flight level, not even really a squadron level on a regular basis, right? Be like a once and like, okay, we can do it again in 10 years.
Yeah.
So, how do we do that on a regular basis? And I love the idea of training airmen to get after this, at the local level, right? To do this within their units and stuff. So looks good.
That's been the goal. So Project Nomad, we initially were like, let's help other units with data analytics. Oh, and we'll do culture strategy coaching on the side because you can't really like go in and fix a data analytics issue without knowing what the culture is, right? And what we found was there's a good demand for cultural strategy coaching, not a demand for data analytics. Well, data analytics is tough because it has, at this point, to be unclassified, not sensitive information.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, units, we can help you do data analytics better, which means you have to actually ask for help, which, it doesn't happen often. So we've had, with Project Nomad, through advertising on Air Force Quarantine University, we've had a decent reception. We get about 2 to 3 inquiries every ad we put out, with 2 to 3 serious inquiries. Well, I'm sorry, 2 to 3 inquiries with only 1 being a serious inquiry.
Gotcha.
Which, to be honest, for the muscle we have, that's about all we can handle, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's fantastic, though. That's good to hear. It's definitely, I also have done some, mission and vision, strategic goal setting, OKRs, things like that, right? A couple of workshops. But you're right, that's very surface level, right? Okay, we did that. Okay, there's this thing. What do we do with it? Having something like this really digs into that data underneath and those layers underneath to really understand how those fit in to the organization. So it's good.
Thanks so much for joining, and thanks for staying. Like, I know this was a long call, but
it's okay. It was good. It was worth it. It's all good stuff. I loved hearing about it. Daniel's and Austin's questions are tough, but they obviously mean well. So
yeah,
it's good stuff just to see, hopefully Project Nomad keep going and
Sure.
continue on.
Again, long-term goal, like I would love to see this, not something special out there. I'd love to see like units doing something similar, at least, that gets after the cultural piece, because that's a lot of times it's, not even considered. Like it's that side excursion that, oh, if we have time, we'll get there. And then you never have time.
Yeah. The best thing I loved was trying to balance that dichotomy between where we perceive we are, where we would like to be, and where leadership is trying to take us. Right. And that whole balancing act. I love that. I think that would be probably one of the most valuable things that flights could have,
right?
Is to understand that, understand what members want, where we think we are today, and get leadership on board with, bringing everyone together on the right solution. So, coming up with a vision statement, helps, but it's like, okay, but that doesn't change where I am today. I think how to get to that future state is this way, but leadership thinks it's this way. Like that's not the same place. So
Communication, alignment, and just alignment in general is so important. But like, what course teaches leadership alignment, right? I haven't seen one yet. And
Right.
this isn't academics on it either, but it's at least to say, hey, there could be a problem right here. Super tough.
Yeah, I like it. Highlight the problems and then let people, work through the solution, how, whatever works in that localized setting, right?
Sure.
Good stuff. Thanks
Well,
for sharing
thanks
this. I
so much.
appreciate it.
Yeah, really appreciate you joining and participating.
Of course. Looking forward to more sessions in the future.
Cool. Let's do it.
Good to meet you, John. Take care.
Take care.
Alrighty.
Bye.
Bye.